everything. Every test I wrote, I had to do a retest because I always failed the first one. I somehow squeaked through that class, and I did manage to find a job. And it's a job that, when you consider the longest I held a job before all this was, I believe, 4 months. And I've now been at this job in March, it'll be 18 years. How I managed to fake my way through the first few years, I'll never know. And the job I have is actually on the front lines in a psychiatric facility. And at no point in that time did I ever look at a patient I worked with and thought, man, that's me. You know, I can relate. And I think a large part of that has to do with the stigma surrounding mental health. I talked earlier about the mask, and that's how I continue to live. My coworkers, my friends, they all saw this great, personable, fun-loving guy. I lived in a little 2-bedroom apartment at the time, and as soon as I get into that apartment, I just crumble into my chair and most of the time just sit. I knew something was wrong. I didn't know what. I didn't know about, and surprisingly, considering I worked in the field, I never knew about depression. I never knew what it was. I just felt that this was my life. These were the crappy cards that I was dealt with. Eventually, what happened with me was trying to be that other person, wearing that mask, that becomes rather exhausting. And what used to be fleeting thoughts, and with depression, that's how it started for me, was the fleeting thoughts, about 30 seconds to a minute, where they started getting worse. It wasn't so much anymore about just you suck, you don't deserve anything good in your life. They started getting more serious. Driving down the highway and seeing a semi coming. And just having a quick thought about, if I just turned at the right time, I don't have to feel this way anymore. And then as quick as that thought came, kind of give myself a slap across the face and, shut up, Tyson, what are you doing? Why? It doesn't make sense. And I went on. Through the years, I ended up getting married. Through that marriage, we had a daughter. My daughter was born 2 months early, 3 pounds. So she spent 2 months in the neonatal unit at RUH in Saskatchewan. And, I would go back to North Battleford to work during the week and go to Saskatchewan on the weekends and see this tiny little 3-pound baby who, we were very fortunate because even though she was born so tiny and stuff, there were no real major health concerns with her. But you still, I would look at this baby and my first thought was always, I don't deserve this. Maybe, and if with the neonatal unit, one thing that's very unfortunate with it is you see a lot of babies that don't make it. And, my depression would tell me, well, maybe that's for the best. I can't be a dad. I'm going to be a horrible father. Maybe it's best if this little girl doesn't make it. Well, she did. And as time went on, the marriage didn't work out. And my daughter who was 6 at the time. And I would get her every second weekend, and we'd play board games, take her to the park, and after I drop her off every Sunday, it was the same thing. Those fleeting thoughts that used to be 30 seconds to a minute long, once, maybe twice a day, they started getting longer, they started happening more, and they really started telling me, why are you still doing this? Why are you trying to be a dad? Why are you trying to be a good dad? And the thing with depression is kind of like any other illness where, if you're sick and you don't go to the doctor, what's going to happen to you? You're going to get sicker, right? And that's what happens. And that's what happened to me, is I got sicker. And those fleeting thoughts weren't fleeting thoughts anymore. They were 24/7 thoughts. They were thoughts that were keeping me up at night. The only time I would sleep is when my body became so exhausted that I couldn't keep my eyes open. And the thoughts, again, they went further than just, you suck. You don't deserve this. You don't deserve your daughter. You're a horrible father. They went further than that. Why are you here? Why are you putting your family through this? Like I said earlier, I had a good upbringing. I had parents who loved me, they cared about me, great group of friends who cared a lot about me, and that daughter loved me. We talked on the phone all the time. When she was with me for a weekend, we'd have great weekends. We'd be out at the park, like I said, playing games, watching Disney movies, all the fun stuff. And then once I got home again, that's when I was able to take that mask off. And like I said before, as a guy especially, we're not supposed to be emotional. We're not supposed to talk to anybody about our feelings. And I would go home at night, and for me it got to the point where I couldn't fall asleep unless I cried. And I would cry. And I cried every night until I'd fall asleep. And the first thing I did when I'd wake up in the morning is I'd cry again. Simply for the fact that I woke up. I knew something had to change. I didn't know what it was going to be. But at this point in my life, depression was telling me I had to do what's right. I can't keep putting my family through the stress, through the worry, through the disappointment I was putting them through. I can't put my daughter through that stress and that disappointment. She had a stepdad at this point in time. He was a much better guy than I ever was. So I knew she'd be well taken care of. And those are the thoughts depression gave me. Those thoughts turned into beliefs. And I got to the point where not only was I mentally exhausted, when you get up and you put that mask on and you go out and face the world day after day, and you go to work, and I played ball and did a lot of things with friends and stuff like that. So 12, 13 hours a day of wearing this mask and joking around and being this great person that everyone liked, it gets exhausting when you get home. And that's kind of when I hit my most vulnerable. And I kind of compare depression to, if you ever watch a cat stalking a bird, you know how it just lays in the grass and it just watches that bird, and then at the perfect time it pounces. And that's kind of how it was for me, right? It saw me at my most vulnerable and it pounced. And at that point, I couldn't fight it anymore. I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't, in my belief, I couldn't go to a doctor, I couldn't go to my family, I couldn't go to a friend. Because what are they going to tell me? You know, for my parents, it would just be another source of disappointment. You know, friends would probably just think I was wimping out and tell me, you know, what are you depressed about? You got a full-time job, you got a car, you got a daughter. You know, people like me shouldn't be depressed. You know, which kind of goes back to what I said earlier about depression, not caring who you are. But for me, I couldn't fight it anymore. I was too exhausted. That mental exhaustion started becoming physical. And to the point where something as simple as sitting up in bed to get out of bed in the morning was actually painful. It hurt to move. Now, it still hurts, and I'm sore when I get out of bed, but that's mostly because I'm fat and I'm shaky. But back then, like I said, I didn't want to fight anymore. I didn't know where to turn. I didn't even know that what I had was a thing. And I've been where I work now for, like I said, almost 18 years. At this point in time, I would have worked there for 10 years. And so that's after 10 years of working in the mental health field, I still didn't recognize what was going on with me. And that's what depression wanted. So I made a decision that the following day, I was going to give up. I spent that night writing letters to my parents, writing a letter to my daughter, to her mom, and to an ex-girlfriend. And these letters weren't, this is what you did, this is why I did this. These letters were, I'm sorry. And I wasn't sorry for doing what my plan was to do. I was apologizing to them for the person I was, for the disappointment I brought into their lives, for the stress I brought into their lives. And you know how depression works? When you make a decision like that, when you make a plan, that's when it actually started kind of being nice to me. You know, that's when it started kind of telling me, okay, you know, your pain is going to end soon. You're going to end, you know, everyone else is going to be better off for this plan. You're making the right choice. Now, who here believes in fate? Anyone? Because when this day came, the day that I had chosen to put my plan into action was filled with fate. So much so that when I think back on it, it still kind of seems unbelievable how everything worked out. But I woke up that morning and the letters I had written the night before, I put them in a nice little row And I didn't know at what point in that day my plan was going to carry itself out. I just knew it was going to be at some point that day. I figured at some point that day, that switch is going to go off in my head, and it's going to tell me, okay, Tyson, now's the time. I spent that day in my little apartment, pacing back and forth, walking around, making sure I had things in order, just kind of waiting for this switch to go off. One thing about me is I don't like to walk very much. So at some point I had to sit down. And I turned the TV on, and I turned to the channel guide, and as shows started trickling down and stuff, I saw a show on the guide on TSN. We all know what TSN is? Have you heard of a show called Off the Record with Michael Landsberg? Well, I saw that on my TV guide. And when Off the Record first started, I think it was about 15 or so years before this day, I watched it religiously. At this point in time, it became a show that I watched only when nothing else was on. So I saw it on the channel guide, and I let the guide go through to see what else was on. It turns out, as fate would have it, nothing else was on that day. So I turned it to Off the Record. And on that particular episode, on that particular day, Michael's guest was a guy by the name of Stefan Richer. Do we know who Stefan Richer is? Some? I forget how young you guys are. Stefan Richer was the last Montreal Canadian to score 50 goals in a season. He won the cup with them in '93, I believe. And he also won one a couple of years later with New Jersey Devils. And again, I actually almost turned the TV off because Stefan Richer was a hat. Why would I want to waste my time listening to what a cheating hat has to say? What happened during that interview was, it was about a minute, there was about a minute and a half part of that interview that changed my life. And during that minute and a half, Michael had asked the fan to talk about his depression. Now, he had never talked about it on TV before. He'd never talked about it publicly before. And so he started talking about it. He started sharing some experiences he had. And he shared one story in particular after the summer after he won the cup with the Devils. How he was driving back from Montreal, and on the highway, every time he came to a big turn and he'd see a power pole there or a set of trees there, he'd think to himself about hitting that gas, and if he hit that just the right way, he could end his misery. Now, when you think about that, here's a guy who's living virtually every Canadian boy's dream. Not so much playing for Montreal, but the fact that he not only made it to the NHL, but he became a superstar in the NHL. And he won a Stanley Cup, and he won it twice. The hardest trophy in pro sports. And here's the Stanley Cup, this two-time Stanley Cup champion, driving back from New Jersey, who doesn't know where to turn. And as he's sharing this story with Michael, I'm sitting in my chair, and by this point I'm bawling, and I'm nodding my head, because everything Stefan has said, I've related to. And it was almost as though, minus the NHL and Stanley Cups, that he was talking exactly about me. And I almost felt this sense of relief that it was like I finally have a name for what's going on. I finally know what's wrong with me. And here's this guy who played in the NHL, who won Stanley Cups, and he's on TV with most likely thousands of people watching, and he was almost in tears as he was talking about it. At the end of that interview, Michael thanked him for sharing, and then admitted that he also had suffered and struggled with depression. And at the very end of that episode, Michael's email popped up. Now, the last time I had written a celebrity, I wrote to the Boston Bruins when I think I was 8 years old. So, I sat down at my computer and I put his email in, and I just wanted to send him a quick, really good job. That was really great that they did a show like that, because it was really going to help someone. And that for me, I was sitting there, and for me it was too late. I kind of knew that. But I just thought that it was really cool that those two guys would sit there and talk about it and know that it's going to help someone. Little did I know. Within a few minutes, my computer, every time I would get an email, it would kind of send off this little ding. And within a few minutes of me sending that email, I got one back. Now, I figured this was some assistant of Landsberg's, paid to answer his emails and stuff, and it would be a token, thanks for watching the show, thanks for the support kind of thing. So, the first couple of emails were me kind of just feeling the person out to see if it actually was Michael Landsberg. Me and Michael shared about 8 or 9, maybe 10 emails throughout that afternoon. I couldn't tell you what all of them said. I couldn't tell you, what they all were about. I hadn't told him at that point that what my plan was for that day. I had just basically told him what I'd been going through and stuff. But one question he asked me during that little conversation was if I'd ever gotten help, if I'd ever told or would tell anybody else. And of course my answer was no, I hadn't. I hadn't gone to a doctor. I hadn't told anybody. And he sent an email right after I sent that one, and it was just a simple why. I did tell him that I felt it was too late for me. I didn't tell him that my plan was for that day, but I did tell him it was too late for me, or that's how I felt. But he said, if you've never even tried to get help, why is it too late? And a simple question that just kind of had me sitting there like, you know what, this guy's maybe talking some truth. Shortly after that switch I talked about earlier, that I'd spent the day waiting to go off, well, it went off. And as much as I tried to say goodbye to Mike in those emails, he hates that I call him Mike, by the way, but he's not going to see this anyways. So as I'm trying to say goodbye to him, he keeps emailing me. And again, at this point, he has no idea what my plan is. And so I'd send him an email, and I'd get up, and I'd walk to finish off this plan I had, and then I'd hear a ding. So I'd go back to the computer, I'd reply, and then I'd get up again, and sure enough, there's another ding. And it kept going that way. Till finally I looked at my computer and I said, man, even an email, this guy doesn't shut up. Well, I'm very grateful he didn't shut up that day, because after that brief conversation, and after that simple question of why didn't I at least try to get help, like I said, it made a lot of sense to me. And I actually felt better. It actually felt good. Even though it was over email, and even though it was to this celebrity that I would most likely never meet, it still felt good to let it out and to tell somebody else what I've been going through. So I went through that day, obviously, without putting that plan into action. And I woke up the next day, and I felt better. And I felt better because, like I said, it was just this huge relief that I was finally able to tell somebody what I've been going through. But also, like I said earlier, when you're sick and if your doctor gives you a prescription, say for 10 days, and after 4 days you start feeling better, so you decide to stop taking that medicine, what's likely going to happen? Exactly, you're going to get sick again. And that's what happened. Only this time, it was sicker than I've ever been in my life. And I don't know the time frame of when that conversation with Landsberg happened and when I hit my bottom. I want to say it was about a few weeks. And when I hit that bottom, I hit it hard. And I remember I was out at work that day, and I was wearing that mask, and I was hilarious. People at work loved me, the patients loved me. It was probably one of the better days I had. And I walked into my apartment that night, and I sat down, and I just crumbled. There was, in my belief, that night, I didn't know what to do. I used that talk with Michael as my initial medicine, but I hadn't followed up on anything. I hadn't went to a doctor. I hadn't tried to get him to see a counselor. I just coasted on that initial thought. And I walked into my apartment that night, and depression pounced, and it pounced hard. The one thing I remembered that night was in that conversation with Michael was that I had said to him I'd never gotten help. I'd never tried getting help. Well, this night I knew I needed help. I didn't want to put my plan that I had worked on before. I didn't want to put that plan into action. But I knew if I didn't reach out, if I did try to get help, that very well could have been my last night. By this point, we're looking at about 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. And so I just grabbed the phone book and I looked for a suicide hotline. And in phone books, well, if anyone uses them anymore, at the very front cover, there's usually different numbers, emergency numbers, hotline numbers, stuff like that. In North Battleford's phone book at that time, I looked through all those numbers. I was looking for like a suicide hotline or something. I didn't find one. What I did find was a sexual assault hotline. Now, I figured, okay, well, they're probably, the assault hotline and the suicide hotline are probably buddies. They gotta have each other's number. And so I called that number, and a lady answered, and for some reason, even though I had been bawling, even though I was shaking, I was an absolute mess. As soon as she said hello and what the hotline was, I immediately took a deep breath and went into my best imitation of a businessman I could possibly be at 2 o'clock in the morning. And I just, hello, would you happen to have the number of suicide hotline? Except I tried to do it even, I think, with a British accent. I have no idea why. And there was a pause on the other end of the phone. And then she said 3 simple words, "Are you okay?" And then there was a pause on my end of the phone. And then I just went back into that blubbery mess I was before, and I let everything out. I don't know, I could hear in the background, I think she picked up a cell phone to call the cops to come check on me, while she stayed talking to me the whole time. Because it was only a few minutes later when some police did show up at my door. They weren't like some of the stories you might hear about police. These people were really good people. They sat down, we talked a while, and to the point where we all agreed it was best that I go with them, and they took me to the hospital. I spent about a week on the mental health ward of that hospital. It's definitely a different experience. The nurses' aides working there, great people. I didn't really talk to a doctor a whole lot, but the one person I got the most out of during that week, I don't know his name, I never got it. I often think about him. He was another patient that was in there. And he was in there for the same reason I was. And the thing with this guy was, he wasn't from North Battleford. He was from a couple hours away. And once a year, for 2 weeks, he would take off work and he'd come and stay on the mental health ward in North Battleford, so that his co-workers and his friends and family, they all thought he was on vacation. They all thought that he took this vacation and just didn't tell anybody where he was, just to be alone. Well, this was his vacation. And this guy was a monster. This guy was probably 6'4", 6'5", over 300 pounds. He was probably the manliest man you would ever meet. And I would look at this guy and he would tell me what he'd been through, and it was like me and him were the same person. And I thought, yeah, even though this guy drives in 2 hours, but just the fact that he can come into this hospital and say he needs help, it must be okay. So I spent the rest of the week in the hospital. The doctor, told me what he thought I had, which was depression, and what I need to do. And as it turns out, for me, the best treatment I've had for it has been talking. Reaching out, talking about it. I go to a therapist, every couple of weeks or so. And even if I'm on that high, if everything in my life is going great, I still make that appointment. Because I know if I stop making those appointments, then I could very easily get sick again. And I don't want that. I know my new wife wouldn't want that. And I know my 2-year-old daughter wouldn't want that. My other daughter is 13 now. So she's kind of in that stage where she's almost too cool for me now. But I know she wouldn't want it either. We talked about, in that video, it talked about the stigma. I was telling a friend not that long ago when he had asked me what my plans were for that day. And I told him what my plans were, and one of the last things I said was I have an appointment with my therapist. As I said that, 9 people down here gave themselves whiplash, whipping their heads around to stare at me. And 9 isn't an exaggeration. I know it was 9 because that's how long they stared at me, long enough to be able to sit there and actually count them. But the 2 people I noticed the most were sitting at other tables, and they didn't lift their heads up at all. And those were the 2 I thought of, because those are the 2, and they could have just been having a quiet morning, who knows. But one of them or both of them could have been sitting there, struggling, and thinking, maybe today's the day I'll tell so-and-so about what I've been going through. And it made me think that, how would they feel? How would they think if they happened to see me talk about going to see a therapist, and all these people around whip their heads around and stare at me? Probably not very good. So that's basically what my message is. For anybody out there who's struggling or knows someone who's struggling, it's okay to reach out. You've got absolutely nothing to be embarrassed about, nothing to be ashamed of. As you saw in the video, 1 in 5 people. That's a pretty big number. Speak out, reach out. Someone will reach back. I was worth it when I did it. Everyone in here is worth fighting for.